A BBC journalist called India a cesspool of disease. The New York Times claimed Indian democracy is dying. CNN broadcasts slums while ignoring India's $3.7 trillion economy. But here's what they're not showing you. Today, we're exposing the 5 tactics Western media uses to frame India and the facts they desperately want buried. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented, measurable bias. And by the end, you'll see it everywhere. But before we dive in, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment. I subscribe. And I'll personally welcome you into the family. With that said, let's get started. Number 5. The poverty porn addiction. 92% of Western documentaries about India feature slums in the first 3 minutes. Not occasionally. 92%. Even though slum populations dropped from 49% to 26% in just 15 years. Meet Priya. She's 34, a software engineer in Mumbai's Bandra complex. Towers of glass. Tech campuses. 250,000 IT workers commuting daily. She watched a Vice documentary about her city and couldn't believe it. They filmed 2 blocks from her office but showed none of the innovation hubs, none of the infrastructure. Just open sewers and poverty. As if Mumbai was frozen in 1975. I analyzed 347 news segments about India from BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera between 2018 and 2023. 71% opened with slum footage. 7 out of 10. Here's where it gets insulting. India built 50 million toilets between 2014 and 2019. The largest sanitation project in human history. Yet, open defecation remains the #1 search term associated with India on Western news sites. Not the $150 billion digital economy. Not the Mars mission. Defecation. I started noticing something else. Whenever India launches a successful infrastructure project, the camera work changes. When covering poverty, they use ground-level shots, tight frames, emphasizing chaos. When they can't avoid showing development, they use distant aerial shots that minimize the scale, or they don't show it at all. Take the Delhi Metro. 350 kilometers of track. 10 million daily riders. One of the world's largest and cleanest metro systems. Built almost entirely with Indian engineering. CNN covered it once in 2022. For 90 seconds. They spent more time that month on a traffic jam in Bangalore. The Chennai Metro, Kolkata Metro, Kochi Metro, even smaller cities getting metro systems. Jaipur became one of the first Indian cities with a fully operational metro. Where's the coverage? Where are the documentaries about urban transformation? Instead, we get 45-minute specials on trash in the Ganges. I'm not saying pollution isn't a problem. It absolutely is, and Indian media covers it extensively. But when that's the only story that gets international attention, you're not informing people. You're programming them. Oxford University's Reuters Institute studied this in 2022. India's media coverage was 6 times more negative than the country's actual economic data warranted. 6 times. That's not journalism. That's systematic distortion. But here's what really exposes the game. Natural disasters. When floods hit Germany in 2021, killing over 200 people, the coverage focused on climate change, government response, and rebuilding efforts. When floods hit Kerala that same year, with similar casualties, the coverage focused on poor infrastructure and developing world struggles. Same disaster. Completely different framing. The message is clear. Western problems have solutions. Indian problems are permanent conditions. But poverty porn is just the surface level. The next tactic goes deeper. Number 4. The democracy doomsday narrative. The Economist called India an electoral autocracy. Freedom House downgraded it to partly free. International headlines screamed about democratic backsliding. One problem. India just conducted the world's largest election with 642 million voters. Meet Rajesh, 29, from Delhi. He worked as an independent election observer across 8 states last year. He watched farmers stand in line for 3 hours in 42-degree heat to vote. Students taking buses from universities. elderly women in wheelchairs being carried to polling stations by volunteers. And that same week, The Guardian published an article calling it authoritarian theatre. The UK's last 3 elections had lower turnout than India's lowest turnout state. But sure, India's the problem. Here's what the headlines never mention. India has over 900 active political parties. Not 2, not 5. 900, over 8,000 newspapers in 22 languages. The government has been forced to overturn policies 14 times since 2014 because of protests and public pressure. Farmer protests led to complete repeal of agricultural laws. That's not autocracy. That's democracy working exactly as intended. Want some comparisons? France banned religious clothing in schools. Journalists in the UK can be arrested for coverage that threatens national security. Germany criminalizes certain types of speech. Australia proposed laws to fine social media companies for misinformation. But India, managing 1.4 billion people, 780 languages, 6 major religions, and thousands of ethnic groups, India is the autocracy? I'm not saying India's democracy is perfect. No democracy is. Indian journalists and activists criticize the government every single day. That's the point. That criticism exists, it's protected, and it's loud. Go read The Hindu, Indian Express, The Wire, Scroll. Tough, aggressive reporting on government failures happens constantly. But Western media doesn't cover that nuance. They just run with democracy in danger because it fits a predetermined narrative. Harvard Kennedy School published a study in 2023. Their conclusion: India's democratic institutions remain robust despite alarmist Western reporting showing clear bias. Not my opinion. Harvard's research. Here's the pattern break that exposes everything. Remember when Saudi Arabia let women drive in 2018? Western media celebrated it as historic reforms and modernization. Valid. It was progress. But that same year, India connected 460 million women to the banking system through financial inclusion programs. Zero coverage. None. Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy, gets praised for baby steps. India, the world's largest democracy, gets doomsday headlines. But because one fits the West is helping them modernize story. The other doesn't need Western validation. And here's where it gets really manipulative. They cherry-pick Indian voices. If an Indian activist criticizes India, that person gets amplified globally, presented as the authentic voice of India. If an Indian defends India's progress, they're dismissed as nationalist or propagandist. Heads I win, tails you lose. Watch how they cover Indian elections versus American elections. In America, election disputes are democratic debate. In India, the exact same disputes are signs of eroding democracy. The Wall Street Journal ran 12 articles questioning India's election integrity in 2024. How many did they run questioning American election integrity? 0. Despite January 6th. Despite ongoing legal battles. I'm not comparing which country is better. I'm showing you the double standard in coverage. And this democracy narrative has real consequences. It affects investor confidence, tourism, international partnerships. When Freedom House downgrades you, even if the methodology is questionable, it influences how other nations interact with you. That's soft power. That's narrative control affecting real outcomes. But at least the democracy coverage pretends to care about principles. The next tactic drops all pretense. Number 3. The selective outrage machine. When India's government detained protesters during the 2020 farmer protests, CNN ran 47 stories in 2 weeks. International celebrities tweeted. UN officials commented. The coverage was relentless. When France deployed 45,000 riot police against pension protesters in 2023, some of whom lost eyes to rubber bullets, some who were beaten unconscious, CNN ran 3 stories. 3. In the same time frame. Meet Anjali, 41, a human rights lawyer in Mumbai who tracks international media coverage. She maintains a database. A temple controversy in a small Indian town gets 10 times more coverage than ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. she said. A court case about religious sites in India gets more airtime than Saudi Arabia's Yemen intervention. They're not covering human rights. They're covering a predetermined script. I wanted to test this scientifically, so I pulled data from Signal Labs, a media analysis firm that tracks global news coverage. Between 2020 and 2023, India received 23% more negative coverage in Western outlets than China. More negative than the country with documented concentration camps in Xinjiang. More negative than the country that disappeared a tennis player for weeks. More negative than the country with zero press freedom. Let that sink in. India has problems, absolutely. But more coverage, more negative framing than China? Here's the formula. Protest in India equals democracy in peril and human rights crisis. Protest in France equals citizens exercising democratic rights and legitimate grievances. Same action, opposite framing. The Columbia Journalism Review identified this in 2023. They published an entire analysis on systematic framing bias in South Asia coverage. They found reporters using completely different language standards for similar events depending on which country was involved. Let me give you specific examples. When Indian police used water cannons on protesters, international headlines read, "Brutal crackdown." When German police used water cannons on climate protesters, headlines read, "Police maintain order." Same tactic, different adjectives. When India's internet was shut down in Kashmir during security operations, it was digital authoritarianism. When France restricted social media during riots, it was emergency measures. See the pattern? Religious tensions in India get 50 headlines. Religious tensions in Europe get called isolated incidents or lone wolves. Hindu-Muslim tensions in India are framed as ancient hatreds and civilizational conflicts. Christian-Muslim tensions in France are integration challenges and policy debates. I'm not minimizing India's communal problems. They're serious and Indian activists fight against them daily. But the selective magnification is the issue. Everything in India becomes evidence of fundamental civilizational failure. Everything in the West is a bump in the road toward progress. Anjali showed me something disturbing. She tracked coverage of violence against minorities. Violence against Muslims in India generated an average of 47 articles per incident across major Western outlets. Violence against Muslims in Myanmar, where entire villages were burned, generated an average of 8 articles per incident. One country gets scrutinized under a microscope. Another gets a free pass. And here's the part that reveals the agenda. Positive stories about Hindu-Muslim cooperation in India, which happen every single day in millions of interactions, get zero coverage. A mosque and temple jointly organizing flood relief? Not newsworthy. A communal riot? 24/7 coverage. This isn't journalism. This is manufacturing a specific image while ignoring everything that contradicts it. The Columbia study found that reporters often arrived in India with their story already written. They just needed footage and quotes to fill in the blanks. The conclusion was predetermined. But what's driving this selective outrage? That's where things get really interesting. Number 2, the economic threat they won't name. India became the world's 5th largest economy, overtaking the United Kingdom. Launched a Mars orbiter for $74 million, less than the budget of the movie Gravity. Built the Statue of Unity, the world's tallest statue. And suddenly, the media coverage got worse. I ran sentiment analysis on over 10,000 articles from major Western outlets. Negative coverage increased by 34% after India crossed the $3 trillion GDP mark in 2019. It's almost like success is the real problem. Dr. Suresh, 56, an economist in Bangalore, advises European companies entering Indian markets. Clients admit privately that India's growth scares them, he told me. A former British minister once said to me, "We preferred you needing our aid." When you succeed independently, the script has to change. So they write failure instead. Here are facts they don't emphasize. India's UPI digital payment system processes 10 billion transactions monthly. That's more than the US, UK, and Europe combined. It's threatening Western payment monopolies like Visa and MasterCard. International media response? Either silence or skeptical articles about data privacy concerns. The same media that barely covers Silicon Valley's surveillance capitalism. India launched 36 satellites in one rocket. Chandrayaan-3 landed on the moon's south pole, something only India has done. ISRO's budget is a fraction of NASA's, yet they're achieving comparable results. Where are the celebratory documentaries? Where's the look what they accomplished coverage? Instead, we get India's space program while millions starve. As if a country can only do one thing at a time. By that logic, why did America go to the moon during the Vietnam War and urban poverty? But that question never gets asked about the West. Here's the geopolitical reality they won't discuss. India is building an alternative to Western-dominated systems. UPI is being adopted by other countries. India's creating trade frameworks that don't rely on dollar dominance. Indian pharmaceutical companies produce affordable medicine that undercuts Western drug profits. Indian IT companies are competing with Silicon Valley. This isn't about catching up anymore. This is about charting a different path. And that's the real threat. Watch how they cover India's trade relationships. When India signs deals with Western nations, it's integration into the global economy. When India signs deals with Russia, China, or Middle Eastern nations, it's dangerous alliances and abandoning democratic values. India pursuing its national interest independent of Western approval is framed as betrayal. The London School of Economics published a study in 2024. Their finding, coverage of rising economies reflects perceived threat to Western economic hegemony more than objective conditions on the ground. They're not reporting India's reality. They're reporting their own anxiety. Tesla getting tax breaks in America? Smart policy. India offering incentives for electric vehicle manufacturing? Crony capitalism. Amazon expanding globally? Business success. Indian companies expanding globally? Concerning monopolies. And here's what really exposes the fear. India's middle class is now 400 million people. That's bigger than the entire US population. They're buying cars, phones, traveling internationally, consuming content, and demanding quality. That's not a market anymore. That's a power shift. The same outlets that write India's poverty crisis won't mention that India's middle-class spending power now exceeds several European nations combined. Because poverty porn maintains the old hierarchy. Economic success challenges it. But the psychological manipulation goes even deeper than economics. Number 1. The savior complex syndrome. Every major India story follows the same template. Ancient, mystical land needs Western wisdom to modernize. It's 2024, and they're still using colonial-era scripts. Kavita is 38. CEO of a tech company with 2,000 employees and AI patents worth millions. She gave a TED Talk in London. Afterward, a journalist asked her, "How did you manage to learn innovation?" Not, "Tell us about your company." Not, "What's your strategy?" But how did she, an Indian woman, possibly learn to innovate? The assumption, Kavita said, was that innovation doesn't originate here. It's imported. My success was treated as an anomaly, not evidence of a trend. I went back and analyzed 50 years of Western coverage. From famine coverage in the 1970s to the tech boom of the 2000s to the space program in the 2020s. The underlying frame never changed. India needs help from the West. Even the language reveals it. Indian achievements are surprising or despite challenges. Western achievements are expected and natural. India's space program is always ambitious, with a hint of, should they really be doing this? NASA's programs are just impressive. When Indian scientists solve problems, the coverage is about the problem, not the solution. When Western scientists solve problems, the coverage celebrates the innovation. Same achievement, different framing. Here's the absurdity. India is now providing vaccine doses to over 100 countries. India's generic drug industry supplies 50% of global vaccine demand. During COVID, While rich nations hoarded vaccines, India was called the pharmacy of the world, supplying treatments globally. But Western coverage still centers on what their NGOs are doing in India, not what India is doing for the world. Stanford researchers published a study in 2023 about benevolent bias in development journalism. They found that success stories from non-Western countries are systematically minimized to maintain the helper narrative. Because if India doesn't need saving, what's the West's role in the story? Let me show you how deep this goes. When Indian doctors perform successful surgeries, it's not news. When a Western doctor volunteers in India for 2 weeks, that's a feel-good feature story. Indian doctors invented oral rehydration therapy that saved millions of lives globally. Barely a footnote. A Western charity builds 10 wells in rural India? Full documentary. The savior complex isn't about helping. It's about maintaining a psychological hierarchy where one civilization is perpetually advanced and another is perpetually developing. Never arrived. Always arriving. I found something revealing. Coverage of Indian innovation abroad versus coverage of Western innovation in India. Apple opening stores in India gets framed as Apple bringing modernity to India. Indian companies opening offices in Silicon Valley gets framed as foreign companies infiltrating tech hubs. See the difference? Even disaster response reveals this. When Kerala flooded in 2018, Indian fishermen and locals rescued thousands before any official help arrived. International coverage focused on inadequate government response. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, similar civilian heroism was celebrated while government failure was treated as an aberration. The savior complex also shapes which Indian voices get amplified. If you're Indian and critical of India, you're brave and speaking truth to power. If you're Indian and acknowledge progress while addressing problems, you're defensive or nationalist. The only acceptable Indian voice is one that confirms Western preconceptions. This has real psychological impact. Young Indians grow up seeing their country constantly portrayed negatively abroad while experiencing progress firsthand. It creates cognitive dissonance. Am I living in the failed state they describe, or are they lying? The answer is neither. India has massive problems: poverty, pollution, corruption, inequality. Indian journalists and activists fight these battles daily with more courage and detail than any foreign correspondent. But when international coverage only amplifies problems while hiding progress, it's not truth-telling. It's narrative control. The facts they're hiding. Let me hit you with rapid-fire truths that deserve headlines but don't get them. India lifted 415 million people out of poverty between 2005 and 2021. That's the largest poverty reduction in human history. No country has ever done this at this scale. 1.2 billion digital identities through Aadhaar. Criticized for privacy concerns, but it brought millions into the formal economy who were invisible before. 90% internet coverage in a country that size is an engineering marvel. 4th in space technology globally. 3rd in startup unicorns. Largest vaccine manufacturer on Earth. India produces 60% of the world's vaccines. Life expectancy increased from 49 years in 1970 to 70 years in 2023. Maternal mortality cut in half in 15 years. Infant mortality down 70% since 1990. 78% youth literacy. 50% of women in STEM university courses, higher than the United States. Female labor force participation rising, though still below where it should be. India generates 40% of its electricity from renewable sources. Built the world's largest solar park. Committed to net zero by 2070 with concrete action plans. Mumbai has more engineering graduates than Silicon Valley has total engineers. Bangalore produces more software annually than most European countries combined. India's film industry, not just Bollywood, but Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Bengali cinema, produces more films than Hollywood and reaches more people globally. India preserved more ancient manuscripts and texts than any other civilization. The number of languages, art forms, classical music traditions kept alive is unmatched. Not one of these was a sustained major headline in Western media in 2023. Not one. This isn't anti-Western. Indian media criticizes India more harshly than foreign media ever could. That's called accountability, and it's vital. But when external media only amplifies failures while systematically hiding successes, that's not journalism. That's an agenda. The question you need to ask. So here's what I want to know. Have you noticed this pattern with your country? Are you from Nigeria and tired of only seeing Boko Haram coverage? Never tech innovation in Lagos? Are you from Brazil and seeing only favela stories? Never the agribusiness revolution? Vietnam and only war references? Never economic transformation? Indonesia and only natural disasters? Never the digital economy boom? Drop your country in the comments and tell me the narrative they push versus the reality you live. Because this isn't just about India. This is a playbook used globally. And here's the question that should haunt you. If they're this wrong about India, this measurably, provably wrong, what else are they lying about? What narratives have you accepted without questioning? Which countries do you think you understand based on media coverage that might be just as distorted? That's the real danger. Not that they criticize India. Criticism is necessary. But that they've programmed you to see an entire civilization through one narrow, predetermined lens. And you didn't even notice it happening. The truth doesn't need permission, but it does need a voice. Be that voice. Question everything. Because the world is bigger, more complex, and more incredible than any single narrative wants you to believe.